You're listening to Gradient Dissent, a show about making machine learning work in the real world, and I'm your host, Lukas Biewald. Erik Bernhardsson is the CEO of Modal Labs, one of the most loved products in the AI space, maybe almost as loved as Weights and Biases. I was really excited to talk to him, and I really get in the weeds with him. I've been trying to connect these guests more to a general audience, but fair warning, I don't do a great job in this episode. We really nerd out on the development process and what Modal does. So if you want a hardcore interview, this one's for you. If you're looking for AI fluff, you should skip to the next episode.
You know, I've been hearing a lot of really, really positive reviews about your product. And then I used this interview as kind of a forcing function for myself to give it a try. And I have to say, it is really delightful.
Nice.
To use.
I like to hear that. Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad to hear.
And it was kind of interesting to go back to your original, kind of blog post where you're talking about it. It does seem like, you guys have been around, I guess, two years now since you...
A little bit more, like 3.5, 4 years almost. Yeah.
It does seem like you've stayed super close to the kind of vision laid out in the blog post from what I could tell, despite, the use cases evolving. But I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe before I jump into the actual interview, maybe you could just say for people that don't know what Modal does.
Yeah, so Modal is an infrastructure provider focused on data, AI, machine learning use cases. So it really is a fairly general purpose platform. You write some Python code. We take care of all the infrastructure running that in the cloud. In particular, we focus a lot on GPU availability. So let's say you have a model and you want to scale that up, like you can rely on Modal to sort of, push that model into production. And we handle all the auto scaling, all the containerization, all the provisioning, so that data, AI, ML teams can focus on what they're good at, which is to build models and iterate and experiment. And we can handle the stuff that we're good at, which is the infrastructure and the containers and all of that stuff.
And, I think there are other companies that might make a similar value proposition, but it seems to me like Modal is clearly the most loved company with that value proposition. Do you have any theory as to why that is?
Probably because we focus on the developer experience so much.
Yeah.
Because I think that's always been our sort of strongest competitive advantage is like we just went all in on like let's like make this a fantastic product or in particular like I decided I wanted to build something I always wanted to use and feels delightful. I have a background in consumer products my whole life. Like in particular, I was at Spotify for many years, and I sort of want that sort of same like magic feeling the first time you try out the product. Like I always wanted to have that in Modal. So maybe it's that this obsession with like customer, like consumer, like developer experience.
One of the things that's interesting when you go back to at least I think I found the blog post where you sort of announce your product is you're talking a lot about data teams as opposed to AI teams. Is that sort of like a sign of the times? Or has something evolved? It is. Got it.
I think so. I think I kind of mentioned this maybe like in a side note, and maybe I didn't mention it in the blog post, but in my head, like, titles come and go, but the sort of problems sort of remain, which is, like there's for a while there was like analytics engineers, and it's like AI engineers, machine learning engineers, data scientists, like all of those like titles have like, had like ebbs and flows, but like I think there's this sort of unifying set of things that those people need from infrastructure, which is not necessarily served in sort of traditional infrastructure like Kubernetes or Docker. And that's why I prefer to just talk like very generally about data teams. But when I talk about data teams, I actually like mean all of those people, right? Like machine learning, AI, and all these things.
Have you not seen an evolution in the types of people using Modal? At Weights and Biases, we definitely have seen kind of a shift from people with more of a statistical oriented background to more people with kind of a software engineering background. Have you not seen any evolution like that with the excitement around kind of LLMs and a focus on inference?
A little bit. Like definitely when we started the company, like Gen AI was not a thing, right? Like so, and so we didn't necessarily target, like we wouldn't think like inference was even like the killer use case, the way it sort of turned out to be. So we kind of built this very general purpose platform. We had a lot of different things in mind, like ETL, doing, embarrassingly parallel stuff, or cron jobs. And then like mid 2022, like a lot of people started coming to us and they're like, hey, there's this thing called Stable Diffusion. Like, can we run this on Modal? It seems like you have GPU access, you can do things serverlessly. And we realized like this is actually a big opportunity. So we should jump on that and focus on that. And that is now by far the biggest segment that was sort of catered to. I think this, you know, there's sort of a thing even beyond that, which is more of like, I think it was like, there's a lot of traditional software engineers who suddenly realize like they can do AI stuff because of this like LLM stuff. I don't necessarily think that's like where we do well today, but we might try to focus a little bit more on that. I think we focus a little bit more on the sort of traditional machine learning engineer, like people who are like building their own models, they're writing Python. I think that's been a little bit of a dividing line too. It's like Python versus TypeScript. A lot of these people, the like very latest sort of, you know, group of people coming to AI, they're actually not necessarily like Python developers. They're like, you know, doing JavaScript and they realize like, oh, I can call OpenAI and I can do all this like prompt engineering. That's not necessarily a group we've done super well with. I think we've done really well with the sort of people who have been writing Python for many years, using Torch, using, you know, transformers, diffusers, you know, and they see the value in modal of like not having to deal with infrastructure. And that is, I think, our core audience today. But we're very interested in the kind of expanding beyond that too.
I mean, I guess the Python library that feels most similar to modal is probably Ray. Is that fair?
I think that's right.
And were you inspired by Ray, or do you feel like Ray solves a different problem? Like, how do you interact with that?
I wouldn't say necessarily inspired, but I think there's sort of convergence of like things over time in terms of just like people start working on like very random things because everything is like carte blanche and it's like this wide open field. And then like over time, the sort of market kind of pulls you in the same direction. And then like things end up like kind of looking more similar in a way. I think Ray is very different on the architectural side. Like modal is all in on just like cloud hosted. We run the infrastructure. We're an infrastructure provider, whereas Ray is like more open source. I think in terms of the problems we're trying to solve, absolutely. We probably think about things like very similarly. I would put other companies in that bucket too. Like Databricks, I think is another one. There's some more like competitors like Base 10 maybe. Like we're all kind of, I think, thinking about the space in a sort of similar way.
But I guess what does it mean? Like what kind of flows from that decision to be like you're all in on the cloud infrastructure? Like the I guess on its face, the interface or the sort of the basic Hello World example was sort of like a decorator that sends something into the cloud of Ray is almost identical to modal, right? So where do you start to see the differences?
Well, I think there's a bunch of different places. Like just in terms of like how to get started, I think that's probably like the biggest one. Since we went all in on just like, we're only going to be hosted, like all you need to do is to pip install modal and then write some code and we'll immediately run it in our infrastructure. There's like nothing to set up, right? Like there's no configuration. There's no, like we bootstrap the tokens for you in a few different ways. So there's no like sort of installing stuff except the modal Python SDK. So that's like one thing. The other thing, which is I think even more profound, is more of like a business model implication, right? Like because we're a hosted provider that you can't run on your own platform, like the whole go-to-market is very different. The whole business model, the whole pricing structure, like all our revenue comes from running, you know, basically like GPU, like running GPUs in the cloud and CPUs to some extent too, right? So that's a very different pricing model, right? And so it's all usage-based. We're also serverless, which means, you know, we only charge for the time you actually run the code. So I think, you know, that's where like the real divergence happens, I think, is more in terms of the go-to-market and the business model. Like being only cloud hosted, I think, is a very different business model these days.
Totally. That makes sense. And I guess, you know, one of the things that you hear a lot about, we had the Ray or AnyScale founder on the podcast maybe a year or two ago, and he really talked a lot about distributed training. And again, that might be kind of sign of the times, but I feel like it seems like you're giving more examples around data pipelines and inference than massively distributed training. Is that fair? Or
I think that's fair. Like we don't support multi-node training today. It's something we're quite interested in adding support for. We found a really nice product market fit in Inference, which is actually kind of surprising. But like, because what I started on was this like serverless idea of like I want to have the ability to like create containers, run things like interactively in the cloud, and then we realized like actually that makes a lot of sense also for inference, because if you can start containers very quickly and shut them down very quickly, you can build this like auto-scaling inference framework, right? So we found product market fit pretty early in that. I also tend to think that like the focus on training has existed because that's like the sort of first step of every machine learning AI product is like they have to train at a very large scale. And I think it also to some extent like fit this like VC narrative of like, like it's going to be very expensive. You have this like capital intensive thing, you need to invest a lot in training. But then once you have this model, you have this like proprietary mode, and now you can like make a lot of money in inference. I don't know if that's necessarily true because there's so much competition in this space. But what I think is true though, is that if you think about it, actually inference is where you make money, right? So like when I look at this space and the opportunity as an infrastructure provider, I actually think inference is a lot more exciting because in the long run, in order for AI to generate money, you have to run inference at large scale. And that's where we can be a platform that offers all this, auto scaling, serverless architecture, all the load balancing and routing and all these things to those people that need to run inference at scale. And that's where also we've seen now like a lot of success, like powering some very large use cases.
I mean, I was going to say, I think at this point, it seems pretty clear from an investor perspective that, or anyone's perspective that, kind of the inference workloads are bigger than the training workloads. I would think. I mean, you see like a lot of companies that seem to be doing really well with different types of inference workloads. Like, how do you fit into that? Like, I think some companies go with a very clear sort of like cost, speed, trade-off of a specific model, but you seem way more focused on the developer experience.
Yeah, and I think where we've done really well has been customers to have their own proprietary models. Like sooner, right? Like they train their own models, which actually they train outside of Modal. And then they run all the inference in Modal because we help them not have to build an infrastructure platform for them. And we have a number of customers like that, like very sort of custom models, like typically diffusion models. So like audio, image, music is where we do the best. We do have a lot of customers that run text and LLM and stuff like that, but like it's a little bit of a smaller segment because I think that there's so many people competing in that space. But so I think to me, like, there's always going to be people who need to run custom code, and that's the infrastructure provider that we want to be. We want to be a provider that focuses on the machine learning engineers, like building very custom pipelines, and they need to run things at scale, and they don't want to deal with all the infrastructure necessarily.
That makes sense. I would think though, like, you've spent all this time kind of making things easy to get set up. Are there different challenges that happen when somebody gets to real production scale? Like I might imagine they would want more kind of fine-grained control over things, or I'm not an infrastructure guy, so it's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse.
Yeah, and I mean, I also like think that like big challenge is just like scale and like stability and performance, right? Like when you're running thousands and thousands of GPUs at scale and handling, 10,000 requests a second. Obviously, you're building a very different product than like when you're building sort of, sort of a way to get started and run a machine learning experiment. So that is something that we've had to spend a lot of time on in the last few years, like just scaling the core systems, which is also something I had to go through, sort of fortunately at Spotify about 10 years ago, like we scaling, the platforms. So there's a lot of like just like core investments in like the, scaling to, the next 10x, getting to the next order of magnitude in terms of usage.
I guess as an admirer of your, product, I'm really curious about your development process. Can you talk about how you think about, prioritizing different types of customer requests, like how you do planning, like how you think about product trade-offs? Like what's your like development cadence like, and how do you make decisions in your organization? Maybe just start by saying how big your company is.
Yeah, we're small, like, full disclosure. So I think when it comes to like planning and project management, like you can be, we're about, I think 15 engineers at this point, which is, by the way, like 2x more than we were like 6 months ago. But still, we're small enough that we can actually like, I think there's a sort of minimum viable bureaucracy you need. And that's actually almost nothing when you're at this scale. Like you can sort of almost rely on people to sort of self-organize and do things that they think is the most important thing. As you grow, obviously, you need more layers and more project managers. But right now, it's very little. We do continuous deployments. As soon as you merge something, it goes into production within 30 minutes. By the way, also that's also maybe like kind of going back to our conversation about like hosted versus like self-hosted. Like because we control the entire infrastructure, it's so much nicer in the sense that like, we can just push out code and like, immediately have it run for all the users in production. Apart from the client, which is actually we have a more complex deployment model for. But yeah, so we focus a lot on like rapid iterations, like running experiments. I almost think like early days, I always think it was like gradient descent in terms of revenue. like you can almost like I think it's like people like talk about, you have to have a vision, and you have to avoid local minima. I actually think that's wrong. I think you could just like focus on what customer tells you that they would pay more money for, and just like build those things like very quickly and like try to iterate very quickly. The thing need to be careful though is that a lot of customers will ask for like things that they actually don't want, and then you have to like kind of like figure out okay, what's behind that question, and then build that thing. But I think to a large degree, you can actually just like listen to your customers, talk to your customers, have like rapid feedback cycles where you like constantly like learn from your customers, and then just trying to figure out, okay, what are the things that we need to build so that they can spend 2x more money on Modal, and then build those things and constantly keep iterating like that.
It's funny. I've been on a lot of podcasts like saying almost exactly what you're saying. I feel like sometimes
the name of the podcast is Gradient Dissent, right?
Yeah. Well, I actually don't make the gradient descent point. I'm just like, I think a baseline of just sort of doing what customers are asking for, like getting to the root of what they're asking for and trying to deliver what they want is probably better than how most startups are able to execute. So you can do a lot worse than just trying to deeply understand your customers and and give them things that'll make them successful. And harder
maybe
to do
it's
in
like
practice.
maybe it's like sort of midwit theme where like on the
Totally.
two ends of the spectrum, it's like do the things that your customer asks you to do, and in the middle you need like you need a sprint, you need a scrum, you need an agile, whatever. But I found that like doing the ththings that the customer want is actually the easiest way to grow revenue.
Totally. Do you I'm trying to think now back about at the early days of Weights and Biases trying to do this. Like some of the things that come into tension are like when like a bigger customer might kind of have different needs and they want something versus a smaller customer. Like do you have a way of thinking about those trade-offs? Are you just like, hey, our North Star is like we want revenue to go up, so we're gonna like do the thing that we think will generate the most revenue?
I think almost all the time, like, no, like you should just like do the things that the biggest customer tells you to do. I think there are things, maybe kind of go back to what I said about like sort of deployment model and business model implications, like where I do sort of sometimes refuse to do certain things and cross certain red lines. Like for instance, like we do run into a lot of conversations where people want self-hosted modal. And today we basically said like, no, we're not going to do that, right? And that is like, a conscious decision to forego a lot of potential revenue opportunity, right? But I think the only reason why we're saying no is because I think that would set us onto a very different path where, we might cause a lot of issues in terms of lose our ability to iterate and, maybe lose our ability long-term to make revenue. So that would be like the only sort of red line that I have, where like sometimes like I don't listen to customers. But generally, I think whatever they tell me they need, like we try to figure out a way to build that, which is not necessarily, again, I really want to stress this, like 99 or at least like 80% of the time, when customers tell you to do, want you to do a certain feature, they actually don't want the feature that they're asking for. But so you need to understand, okay, well, what is the problem that this feature is solving for them? And then build, solve for that problem, right? And I would say like 80% of the time, it's actually a very different feature that solves their problem.
Totally. But I also like just when you touch your app, you feel that there's a lot of care put into the flows. Like I had this experience actually, authenticating with you, where it's always kind of irritated me, that you gotta copy and paste our API token and Weights and Biases like into the terminal, and you guys actually have like a click button where you don't do it, so it's like a little better. But I don't think any customer has ever like explicitly asked us to make the authentication flow better. But it does seem like you've kind of put care into making really nice experiences, at least in the sort of like initial onboarding stuff that I think it's sometimes kind of, it's hard for me anyway to get my organization to do that at the scale that we're at.
I think that's a good point. Like maybe backtracking a little bit on like what I said, like I think there's a lot of stuff that customers ask you to do and you should just do it. But there's actually a lot of stuff that customers will never ask you to do and you should still do them. And I think a lot of that, for instance, like a good area is like the onboarding experience. Because like your users that come to you with feedback, they're obviously going to skew towards existing users that don't have these onboarding problems. Like they already set up, they're already running Modal at production, right?
Totally.
So I think maybe that's where it comes to. It's like you also need to think about the new users, making sure that they have a voice in the process. And I think a lot about what that experience looks like. In fact, I always think the onboarding experience is as core of a product experience as like the actual, core modal SDK itself, right? Like getting started is the product too.
Totally.
And I want that to be magic, because I think that sets the expectation for what the experience will be in the future. And so thinking about that conversion funnel, this goes back to sort of my experience like building consumer product, like really thinking through, what are all the friction points in that process of like someone lands on modal.com, explaining the product, enticing them to get started, and then offering a magic experience like in the first 5-10 minutes when they like try the product. I think that's so critical when you're like having this like bottoms up, developer friendly go to market that we have. Not for every infrastructure provider, right? Like for many, for AWS or like Oracle probably doesn't matter, right? But for us, it's very important to have that sort of magic experience when people start. And that's something I don't think customers would tell us. That's something I want to impress on them. So like,
right.
I just want to make sure they get impressed.
Totally. No, you feel that. I mean, great job with that. What
Thank
about like, do you feel like you get pulled into kind of one-off requests from bigger companies? Like, it does seem like your API is pretty simple. I would just sort of, one of the things that we always kind of have tension with it, weights and biases, is kind of as customers get bigger and they work with us for like longer and longer, they start feeling like they want things that are, kind of questionably part of the product, but certainly from their perspective, clearly, part of the product. Does that come up for you?
I think that's like a very hard problem and very important. Yeah, I think to me, it's like, how do you reduce the sort of conceptual overload? Like, how do you give people the least amount of Lego blocks that, that can still build everything they want to, but like, it's not, 35 different Lego blocks. You want to give them like 5 blocks, because all of those blocks, you're going to have to explain, take a little bit of like conceptual overhead to understand how those things work, right? And so you don't want to do that with too many things. And I think that's like very important to figure out as you get bigger and bigger, because it's like it's very, there's always a trap I think you can fall into when you start adding way too many sort of Boolean flags internally to your SDK to do like this thing or that thing and this thing. And then, it all doesn't really, like a new customer would never like discover those things, or they're not composable in the right way, or so I don't know. Like there's definitely a tension between those things.
Have you made product decisions that you regret in retrospect on the modal product?
That is a very good question. I wish I wish you'd asked me, like I could have thought about it. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but there's got to be like a lot of stuff. Like I feel like now that I think about it, there's got to be some stuff I've regretted deeply, but for some reason I can't think of it right now.
Anything you've like deprecated?
We definitely keep changing the SDK all the time. And that is kind of frustrating for customers. And part of that is like, we're trying to get to the client version 1.0, where I think things will be a little bit more consistent. But in order to get to that 1.0, unfortunately, we have to change a lot of stuff. Like for instance, like we used to call internally in the SDK, instead of calling it an app, we used to call it a stub. And then like we realized like, actually, this doesn't make any sense. Like why are we like confused? Why do we introduce like 2 different concepts? Let's just call it an app in the client. So now we have to have this like super long deprecation window of like, okay, like we encourage people to now call it app, but then, we still allow for stub. And then, at some point we start like, issuing like deprecation warnings. And then at some point we remove it and issue deprecation errors. And, then we have to update all the examples and all these things, right? So those are hard things. We're still pretty early, I think. So I think that's maybe a little bit easier. Like if you ask me in like 5 years, I'm sure I have a lot of like scar tissue from like stupid things we launched in hindsight that like we really had to, that were costing us agony and pain later. I mean, I don't know. You must have examples, right?
Yeah, no, I don't know exactly how it is. No, I do have, I think for me, there's specific, things that come to mind. I think one of the big tensions that we have that I imagine might be even more acute for you guys is how explicit to be with our APIs. Like, I think, some of our engineers, they really have this perspective that we want everything like laid out like super clearly and there's no magic behind the scenes. And that gets in tension with trying to create this like very clean, delightful experience for like a new user that doesn't understand the product well. And that's like always in tension kind of everywhere inside our application. Does that come up for you?
Yeah, all the time. I think my threshold for magic is very high. And I'm talking specific about this magic as in like you're sort of trying to infer what the user's trying to do and like, doing it like for them, right? Like that sort of magic, which is actually, I think, a little bit of like a negative word in development. Like people don't necessarily, like my feeling is like for magic to be like good, you have to have an extremely high bar. Like only do it if it works for 99% of the user. Right? Because there's always going to be some fraction where like it doesn't work. And then like that user has to then disentangle all this stuff and like, walk around and like look at like obscure parts of the doc and try to figure it out. So if it breaks in 10% of the cases, it's not worth doing the magic because then you're just going to, cause a lot more pain for the users that it breaks for. But if you can get it to work for 99% of the users, now you can actually make the magic really worth it. That's kind of my feeling about it. That is very abstract, but does that make sense?
No, totally. It totally makes sense. Yeah, I think that's a good framework. And it's interesting that you can kind of feel actually, I think in your API that you're, or your SDK that you're excited, that you're willing to make things magic. I mean,
yeah, but there's only like one or two things where we do it. And even in those cases, like I don't really love it that much. Like one example, for instance, is like we auto detect the Python modules you're running, and then we like bundle those up and like send it to the cloud. But that, and it works in most cases. Like, and I think that like does make Modal kind of nicer to get started with, but it does break, like I would say for about 1% of the users in kind of super annoying ways. And the workarounds are like really annoying. And so like, I'm kind of like, I have a lot of mixed feelings about this right now. Like in many ways, I'd actually want it to be more explicit. Like maybe you have to tell Modal exactly which Python modules you want to bundle up. And then, and that in that case, like it'd be a little bit more annoying. People would have to add like one line more. But in most cases, people just get started by copy pasting anyway. So it's maybe fine. But it would be more like conceptually consistent.
Interesting.
Maybe. That's like one line of thought that I have.
Huh. I guess, are there any other kind of design considerations that come into tension as you're doing this? Are there any things that like, when someone gets started before you like let them loose, you have to kind of indoctrinate them in the modal way of doing things, or is it all kind of intuitive at this stage?
I don't know. I think like one thing that's like always a tension is like, I kind of want Modal to be more about like, I think it was like programmable infrastructure. But also like, I would say like, if I had to like, criticize Modal, like one of the places kind of breaks is actually that place. Like there's always like people who come to Modal and they're like, okay, can I like dynamically create like 500 functions and deploy them for my users? And like, actually it turns out like you can't really do that because like the way like Modal right now works is like you kind of have to statically lay out your functions. And so that's like, I think a little bit of a tension. And I kind of like the way that there are like hacky ways to get around that right now, and users kind of exploit those. And we kind of tell those users like, yeah, you can do the hacky way this way. But I think to me, it is a tension in the sense like I do want to figure out like, why do they need to resort to these hacky things? Because I actually think like that points to like a deficit in the product that like maybe we need to make it easier to do, especially like kind of doing things like programmatically, like creating functions or apps dynamically. It is kind of annoying right now. And I wish it was more imperative in a sense, like where you could just like, say, I want to create this function, deploy it, like, I don't know. Like, I think there's a sort of schism in like, we need to figure out like the sort of programming, the paradigm a little bit better, I think. But like, I do like that there are like escape hatches. And like, if there's anything I would recommend for like SDK and API developers is like, have ways for your like, for certain users to hack the shit out of your API or SDK, and then learn from those users, and then trying to figure out, okay, how do you offer that in a cleaner way?
What have been some of the crazy hacks that you've seen on your API?
I mean, like, again, like a sort of, some people take sort of undocumented, like lower level API or SDK of Modal and deploy a lot of apps dynamically. Like Modal was never meant to deploy apps dynamically. Like the sort of idea is like you have an app and you have a number of functions in that, and then you deploy that kind of manually, and then those functions can call each other or whatever. But some people have figured out, okay, I want to deploy these like custom apps, thousands of them and like, or tens of thousands of them. And that was never something we intended. But I think it's sort of interesting that people clearly are doing it because they want to do. So like, I kind of want to think about like, okay, how do we solve that in a more elegant way?
What are the kind of use cases where you want tens of thousands of apps? Is that sort of like some kind of serverless architecture they're trying to build, or what is like?
I mean, like I think like a use case that comes up, for instance, is like people who are building platforms. Like I think it was like Modal is a platform, but like sometimes you have like customers who are also building platforms for other customers, or like
I see,
or like here's another example, like people who want to deploy like various comfy UI. I don't know if you're familiar with comfy UI. It's just like drag and drop, like you can create like very complex like stable diffusion workflows essentially, but like all of those workflows, they have to have their own custom images, container images, right? And so the only way to like build container images dynamically in Modal is like you have to create like a separate app. And so people do these things where like if they have like thousands of different comfy UI workflows, they kind of dynamically generate apps with those comfy UI workflows. I'm getting into kind of details here, but like that is an issue where we see like people are really pushing the boundaries of what Modal could do. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do we solve that in a cleaner way? How do we make it more intuitive for those people who want to do those crazy things? It shouldn't be crazy. Like it should be like more intuitive.
Yeah, totally. Do you like, I mean, I guess one real difference that you have, I think, with our business is you have this real infrastructure cost of machines that you're kind of spinning up.
Yeah, totally.
When you think about pricing, are you thinking about that? Like, are you like looking for like a certain margin that you want to make, or like how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is not a software business in that sense, right? Like we don't have software margins, right? Like, and I look at like companies like Snowflake or Databricks or something like that. And maybe Snowflake is like a better example, right? Like, or Datadog maybe, like companies that are purely hosted, right? And look at what their margin opportunities look. And even for those companies, which are like best in class infrastructure providers, like the margins are like 50%, maybe something like that, or 60% in case of Snowflake. That is, I think, as good as it's going to get. I think we can get to that, right? But because our model today, our pricing model is we charge per GPU hour, even though we offer a lot of premium on top of sort of just like the pure GPUs, like all this like serverless ability and all this programming abilities, people will still look at the sticker prices, right? Like they'll go to Modal and they'll go to EC2 and then go to Lambda Labs or whatever, and they're going to compare those numbers. And so how much extra can we charge? It can't be 10x.
Right.
It can maybe 2x. And so I think that puts like an upper bound to how much we can charge. And then of course, the other option, so we have the pricing is like one lever. The other lever is like we can reduce our cost, right? So we also spend a lot of time on that, like being smarter about like how do we manage our resources, right? Like we actually solve a mixed integer programming problem in order to reduce our spend every minute in our backend by basically, it's like subject to all these customer tasks we need to run, find the optimal number of workers in all these cloud providers, all these regions that satisfy those constraints, right? And then also dynamically scale our pool. So we spend a lot of time on that. And so margins right now, like, they're never, they're not software margins. We're never going to get to software margins. But I do think the opportunity is like pretty decent still. Like I think you can build, something that can get to like 50, 60% margins, especially as you go up the stack and layer on like higher level services, which is, I think, a big part of like how you improve margins.
I guess, LLM inference, as it's gotten more lucrative, it does seem like there's ferocious, pricing competition. Like, do you think about that at all? Does that kind of concern you? I mean, you're sort of playing a little bit of a different game here. But I'd imagine,
I totally think so, right? Like, and I think for that reason, like we haven't necessarily tried to, chase LLM inference revenue. We do have people running inference on Modal, and in most cases, like they do that because they want to run very custom workflows, very custom code. As it turns out, actually, like the dollar per token of Modal is pretty good and is pretty competitive. But I think the challenge with a lot of the LLM inference providers is that the switching cost is almost zero. So, especially like the ones serving open source frameworks, right? So since the switching cost is zero, the pricing power is pretty low, right? And it's a sort of a race to the bottom in terms of, squeezing every single, flop out of your GPUs and optimizing those and finding the lowest cost GPU providers, and then, kind of growing also because it's kind of a land grab. And so I don't know how that space is going to shake out. But I do see a little bit of, race to the bottom kind of arms race going on there where like, I don't think, everyone's going to survive. And I think the economics are very brutal in that space. Very good for consumers though. Like, it's very good for the customers of these endpoint providers, right?
Totally.
I think that's sort of the flip side of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, this goes even for OpenAI, right? Like even OpenAI now, is facing a lot of pressures to lower the cost constantly because they're getting a lot of competition, right?
No, totally. I mean, yeah, you see it everywhere. And the API is kind of like you point out, it's like basically the same. It's like text, to all these places. So, totally.
Yeah.
Are there are there big pieces of functionality that are missing that are kind of part of your like core vision for the product? Like, are there things you're kind of dying to get out, or do you feel like with what you're doing, it's like a stage of kind of refinement and iteration with customer feedback?
I think originally when I started thinking about this business, like I was actually really interested in workflow scheduling, which is something I have a background in. So this is like 5 years ago, right? Like I built this, or like 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, something like that. I built this thing called Luigi, it was a workflow scheduler. And then I started thinking about how can I do that, 5 years ago. And I realized like, actually, like in order to run things in the cloud, like today, it's like kind of an annoying experience. So I decided, actually, I'm going to solve the problem below. I'm going to solve the compute provider. But I think to me, that sort of ended up being sort of, just a means to an end. I realized like, fine, I guess I'll have to do the cloud execution in order to give the developer experience that I want. To me, the opportunity space has always been to build a whole stack, with all the different things that you need in order to do data, AI, machine learning. So I'm very interested in kind of moving up in that stack and thinking also about like, other things. And I don't know what that is. Like it could be, it could be workflow scheduling, it could be notebook support, it could be, focusing more on training. But I know that I want to be a provider that can serve the sort of end-to-end life cycle of AI machine learning, like, doing the data pre-processing, doing the training, doing the inference, doing stuff outside of AI, like doing biotech, helping people run simulations or video processing pipelines, web scraping, doing embarrassingly parallel stuff, like doing sort of traditional sort of HPC stuff, right? Like, to me, there's just so much stuff out there that people struggle with that I think Modal could help to do better. So my vision goes way beyond the sort of, what I think of as like the container execution platform. Also goes way beyond Python, right? Like I think right now, Python made a lot of sense to start with because that's the like most widely used programming language in data. But I think there's a lot of new people coming to machine learning and AI who don't want to write Python. Or I think there's a lot of existing applications who are not written in Python. So we definitely want to serve those. Like whether that's TypeScript or Go or Rust or R or whatever, like I don't know yet. Like we're gonna have to like, think about those and prioritize that. But to me, like this is so much. I mean, you must be thinking about this too, right? Like, this. I think this is a very exciting space to be in, right? Like there's so many different things to build, and I think that we're still like very early in this, right?
Although it's kind of interesting is all those pieces that you mentioned. I was thinking, well, they probably would want a container execution platform. So in some sense, it's like, what you're offering today does kind of serve all these things. So would it be sort of like more kind of custom functionality for this use case? Or I guess like you were saying, like, using languages that are sort of native to these different applications would be like another direction that you could go in.
Yeah. One out of many different directions. Like I think of them as like different axes, right? I think of the Roman Empire sometimes. Like, why did the Roman Empire get so big? It's because they didn't have any sort of natural barriers. So in order to defend themselves, they had to like constantly just acquire new territory. And then they grew like bigger and bigger. And I think some startups are like that. Like, I don't know if necessarily we have any sort of natural like interface barriers. Like, when I think of like, how do I want to make Modal, do more things, it sort of naturally just lends itself to like adding more functionality. And I think sort of the end state of that is just like, hopefully I want to do, the whole stack, or serve like a whole life cycle of like AI in production end to end.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Although, you do like, I guess, then you make like kind of focus trade-offs, right? It's like hard to make like, everything good in the sprawl. If
no, yeah, of course, and that's the hard part, right? Like this. I think the sort of exciting part about Modal is like there's so many directions you can go in. The very, very hard part, and this is, by the way, the hardest part about any startup, and I'm curious if you disagree, is that it's just prioritization, right? Like, you especially when you're constrained on resources, like I mentioned, we're 15 engineers. I can't put them on like 25 different projects. Like, we need to be extremely ruthless about like doing, the most important thing first, and then the second most important thing, and then the third most important thing. And that is where I think the most value is created as a startup, is like being very ruthless about like sequencing your project in like decreasing order priority.
How do you think about like growth? Like, is that, I mean, you obviously hired Charles, who's one of my favorite, kind of developer advocates or whatever. I don't know exactly how to call him. He really is like an incredibly talented guy. And you have like a lot of buzz, about you and, social media that I see. Is that something that you like think about and care about? Or are you really focused on, hey, this core product is good, and then that's kind of a byproduct of that?
Yeah, we think about it more and more, right? Like I spent, I kind of feel like we spent like 2-3 years like sitting in a cave just like building this stuff, and now we're kind of emerging from the cave, or maybe like a half a year ago, and now we're trying to like actually like, get customers. I mean, like I think Twitter, social media, stuff like that is like, it's just a channel that I kind of personally have always like used myself, and so sort of lent itself, well in that sense to like, for me to just like exploit that as we sort of promote Modal. I don't know, like I feel like every startup has its own like, idiosyncratic set of channels and go to market, and we just discovered like for now that like we're pretty good at like tweeting, shit posting and like just doing like silly things online, and that's generated a fair amount of growth. I don't know what, how we expand. I'm like frightened because now I'm like, okay, I guess we have to focus on LinkedIn. How do we do LinkedIn? I have no idea.
Why do you have to? You don't have to, right?
I mean, you don't have to, but like, I think at some point you can't, like, I feel like right now, like 95% of our growth is like, can be attributable to like Twitter, like directly or indirectly. And I don't, right. I don't think that's a good thing. I think we need to diversify. I mean, like, you're always going to start with one channel, but like, I think we need to figure out like other channels, and, and I don't know. I mean, Charles is starting to do webinars or like stuff like that. So I think that's really exciting.
This is one that I feel like so many CEOs have these strong opinions based on what's good for their business. But do you have a take on open source models versus closed source models?
Ooh, that's a hard one. I think open source models is going to be very hard to do as a business model. However, there is a big company that has shown that they're willing to spend billions and billions of dollars doing things that they think is, fun to waste money on, and maybe they just have a lot of GPUs idle. I don't know. But like Meta is obviously like spending so much money right now that it's sort of crazy to see that those, but I don't know if like, is any other like, is there going to be a business that can compete with that? Like, I kind of struggle to believe that. Like, I don't know. There remains to be seen. But like, my feeling is like, there's going to be closed source models, and then there's going to be like Meta pushing stuff because they have so many GPUs sitting idle, and or wants to, spend billions of dollars on this because they think it's fun.
Okay. What about, so 5 years from now, do you think that almost all training and inference will happen on NVIDIA GPUs?
I don't think so, and I definitely want that not to be true, because I think the space would really benefit from more competition, right? As much as I love NVIDIA GPUs, right? Like, they've been a fantastic provider of compute, flops. I do think it would be healthy for everyone if there was a lot more competition in the space. I've been saying that every year now for the last 10 years, that there's going to be a new compute provider, and still I don't really see that much. I guess like, the most successful one is maybe Google with the TPUs, but I see stuff around the corner like AWS, with Inference and Trainium. They might gain some market share over the next few years. I think AMD, of course, has some interesting stuff. I think they might be gaining some market share. So hopefully 2025 will be the year of alternative accelerators.
Okay. What about, so five years from now, do you think most companies will still have an ML team that's training models in some capacity, or will they just be using and combining third-party models?
I think that's like, I think a lot about this thing, right? Like, there's every time there's like a new technology, I think people like look at that technology and say that's going to replace all this old stuff. But actually what it turns out is like, no, it actually ends up like growing both parts, right? Like you end up growing the old stuff because they realize actually like they can use this new technology, but then you also end up like adding new stuff, right? Like I don't necessarily like cloud, just to look back on some previous technology. I don't think cloud replaced like operations people. If anything, you need more operations people with cloud. And I don't think LMs are going to replace ML engineers. I think ML engineers are going to use this. Some ML engineers will keep training their own models. Some ML engineers are going to use these LMs. And then there's going to be new people who just use the LLMs just from scratch, right? So I don't think necessarily like these things substitute. I think, every part of the pie is going to grow.
Okay, what do you think about agents?
I really don't have a strong point of view. Like I think on an abstract level, it like makes sense, right? Like, like you want things that can reason about things in that multi-step, way and whatever. But my feeling is like there's a lot of hype for maybe not that much like actual meaningful applications yet. So even though I'm like very bullish on like a very long-term perspective, like I actually feel like there's going to be a little bit of disappointment over the next few years.
Okay, do you think that code generating tools will make software less valuable?
Absolutely not.
Because companies can just generate their own software?
I think it goes back to sort of substitution versus like growing the slice, right? Like engineers have already gotten like, more productive over the last, 30 years. Like every decade, I think engineers have gone 10x more productive, right? Like I look back at like, I started coding 30 years ago, so it's been a while. And I look back at like, when the web came and like, Dreamweaver, Adobe released like Dreamweaver, right? And it was like the first like WYSIWYG editor for HTML. And I remember the headlines were like, this is going to make front-end development unnecessary. And then as it turned out, like, yeah, like some people want to have a no-code front-end development tool. Today there's like Webflow and Wix and a bunch of stuff. But also like the number of front-end developers has grown probably 100x since then. So to me, like, I think, as software engineers get more and more productive using new technologies, the demand actually goes up for them because there's so much demand for software in the world. And then, there's going to be probably 10x more software engineers in 20 years, and they're going to be 10x more productive. And we're also going to have, get 10x more value out of software because of these new technologies. I'm very optimistic when it comes to software engineers.
Are you optimistic when it comes to AGI?
I don't know. I tend to think, with AI in general, like some of these like more profound shifts will take much longer than people think. Just because like, I don't know, I feel like I've been doing this for like, I don't know, maybe you have too, right? Like for 20 years, there's been like sort of, so many different AI winters and so many like, periods of like hype and froth. And so I don't know, like I tend to think in the long term, like we're going to build some amazing stuff, but in the short term, I'm a little nervous. We're kind of set up to be disappointed about, the sort of more profound changes.
Are you pro AI regulation?
No. And mostly because I think it's kind of silly to regulate against things we haven't even seen any sort of real challenges from. Like when I think of like the challenges of, or like the what I'm nervous with AI, it's not like necessarily like AGI running, like building bioweapons by itself because it's autonomous. And I'm more nervous about like misinformation and just like slop online or like stuff like that. And people using deep voice cloning to rip off, old people, steal their paychecks. That is what I'm nervous about. I'm not nervous about AGI, like, running amok. I think, so I don't know. I don't think we should regulate anything until we actually see, the damage that it can cause. And that, I think we're very far from that.
All right. That's probably a good stopping point. Erik, thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's good to connect. And I just really, really admire what you've done, sincerely.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Gradient Dissent. Please stay tuned for future episodes.